Karen stood at the edge of the bridge she had just ordered sealed off, watching the gate swing shut behind the last construction truck, a slow smile spreading across her face. She believed there was no way anyone could reach that ranch now, no supply route, no help, and no way to prove the association had done it on purpose. She was certain that within a week, the man on the other side would have no choice but to sign his land away. She had no idea a federal record from 12 years earlier already told a very different story, and that by morning, a judge would make her pay for every single day. The ranch sat at the far end of Cedar Hollow Valley, a stretch of land that had belonged to Nathaniel Cole's family for nearly 40 years, long before the gated community of Millbrook Ridge had ever broken ground on the hills above it. His grandfather had cleared the land by hand, and the only way in or out was a single wooden bridge crossing Miller's Creek, built decades before any homeowners association existed to claim otherwise. When Millbrook Ridge was developed, the county granted the association a shared maintenance agreement over the bridge, since it technically sat on the boundary line between the two properties. But the deed was clear: the bridge itself, and the right of access across it, belonged to Nathaniel's family outright, recorded in a federal land grant that predated the entire subdivision. For years, that arrangement caused no trouble at all. Nathaniel kept to himself, ran cattle on his land, and let his neighbors assume he was just another quiet rancher. Few of them knew that 12 years earlier, before he ever returned to run the family ranch, he had spent a decade working as a federal magistrate judge 2 counties over. Everything changed the year Karen Whitfield was elected president of the Millbrook Ridge Homeowners Association. Karen arrived with a vision, and at the center of that vision sat a private resort-style marina and clubhouse, built along the creek's edge with direct water access for residents. The single best stretch of land for that project happened to be the meadow on Nathaniel's side of the bridge. Before Karen took office, the association had been run by an easygoing retiree named Frank Doyle, a man who preferred quiet cooperation over confrontation and never once questioned the boundary lines separating Nathaniel's ranch from the rest of the community. Karen had watched Frank's tenure with open contempt, telling anyone who would listen that the association was too passive, too slow, and letting property values stagnate while nearby developments doubled in worth. When she won the presidency by a narrow margin, she treated it less like a civic role and more like the start of a personal project, filling the board with loyalists who rarely challenged her and pushing out anyone who dared disagree. Within weeks of taking office, Karen marched down to the bridge with 2 board members trailing behind her and informed Nathaniel that the association intended to expand the marina onto his meadow, calling it a shared community resource opportunity. Nathaniel listened calmly, then asked her to show him the clause granting the association any authority over land it didn't own. She had none, only the flat insistence that anything visible from the bridge fell under her jurisdiction, deed or no deed. Nathaniel declined without raising his voice, and Karen heard it as a challenge rather than a fact. The very next morning, a notice appeared at Nathaniel's gate, fining him $400 for unauthorized commercial use of shared access infrastructure, a clause that existed nowhere in any bylaw. 3 days later, the fine climbed to $1,200, with a letter promising it would keep rising until he agreed to cooperate with community planning. Nathaniel sent a formal response, attaching a copy of his deed and the federal land grant. Karen read it aloud at the next board meeting and dismissed it in front of the room, telling everyone he was nothing more than a stubborn rancher hiding behind old paperwork. By the end of that month, she had already sketched the marina onto a printed site plan, circling his meadow in red marker, telling her treasurer, a woman named Denise Farrow, that he would give in eventually, that no one held out forever against the whole community. The fines multiplied. He was cited for cattle noise, for offense out of aesthetic compliance, and for parking his truck too close to the bridge. Nathaniel never paid a single one. Instead, he photographed every notice, logged every date, and backed up copies to a server far outside Millbrook Ridge's reach. When association workers planted a sign at the bridge announcing access under review, he pulled it from the ground and kept it as evidence, then quietly installed 2 cameras covering both ends of the crossing. At a packed meeting, Karen announced Nathaniel owed the association more than $9,000 in unpaid fines and threatened to restrict shared infrastructure access if he continued refusing to negotiate. He stood up and asked the board secretary to read aloud the exact bylaw granting them authority to fine a non-member. No one could find it. Karen pivoted to personal attacks, calling him a difficult man dragging down the whole neighborhood's reputation. It was around this time Nathaniel discovered the association had quietly paid a private surveyor from its reserve fund. The resulting report shifted the boundary line nearly 40 feet onto his side, conveniently placing the meadow inside association territory. The invoice approval signature belonged to Denise Farrow. Nathaniel filed a complaint with the county land office, and a records officer confirmed within days that the new survey carried no legal standing whatsoever. Undeterred, Karen sent him an offer to buy the meadow for a fraction of its worth, framing it as his last chance before further action. Nathaniel declined in a single sentence, telling Karen she couldn't buy something that had never belonged to her association in the first place. Frustrated by his refusal to panic, she began recruiting residents to pressure him socially, spreading word at community gatherings that he was hoarding a shared resource out of pure stubbornness. A few neighbors started avoiding him at the mailboxes, though others, like a retired lineman named Gary Booth, found the whole campaign distasteful and refused to take part. Then, one Tuesday morning, Nathaniel woke to the sound of heavy machinery. By the time he reached the bridge, an association construction crew had already installed a steel gate across the crossing, chained and padlocked, with a laminated notice zip-tied to the bars. Access suspended pending compliance review, Millbrook Ridge HOA. There was no other way onto his land. Miller's Creek ran too deep and too fast to cross on foot for another 6 miles in either direction, and the nearest alternate route added a 4-hour drive around the county line, assuming the old logging road hadn't washed out again, which it usually had by that time of year. Karen arrived 20 minutes later in a golf cart, flanked by 2 board members, and stood on the far side of the gate with the same satisfied smile she'd worn all morning. She told him this was simply a temporary measure until he agreed to discuss the meadow, adding that she was sure a reasonable man wouldn't want his cattle to go without water for long. Nathaniel said nothing, only turned his camera toward her and let it record every word. By that evening, his water tank was already running low, his cattle were pacing along the fence line, and his propane supply, never meant to last more than a few days at a stretch, sat at barely a quarter tank with no way to get a refill truck across the creek. Nathaniel spent that first night going through every document he'd saved over the years, until he found what he was looking for, a federal record from a decade earlier, filed when the original land grant was digitized by the Bureau of Land Management. It confirmed, in plain language, that the bridge and the access easement across it were federally protected right-of-way, tied to water rights predating the entire county subdivision, meaning no homeowners association, in any circumstance, had the legal authority to restrict access to it. He called Marissa Cade, an attorney he'd known since his years on the bench, and read her the notice zip-tied to the gate. She went quiet for a moment, then told him plainly that what Karen had just done wasn't a compliance dispute, it was unlawful obstruction of federally protected access, and depending on how long it lasted, it could be argued as an attempt to force him off his land through deprivation of water and supplies. Marissa filed an emergency petition with the county court that same night, requesting immediate removal of the gate and sanctions against the association. Nathaniel gathered his footage, the installation of the gate, Karen's remarks about his cattle, the fine notices, the fraudulent survey, and set everything over before midnight. What Karen didn't know, and what none of her board members had bothered to check, was that Nathaniel had spent 10 years as a federal magistrate judge before retiring to run his family's ranch, and that the emergency docket for cases just like this one still routed, on rotation, through judges in his old district. By 6 a.m., the petition had already been assigned to Courtroom, and a notice went out ordering Millbrook Ridge Homeowners Association to appear that same morning to explain, under oath, why a federally protected right-of-way had been sealed off overnight. Karen arrived at the courthouse with Denise at her side, still convinced this was a formality she could talk her way through. She'd brought the fraudulent survey, a folder of fine notices, and a prepared statement about protecting community resources, certain that whichever judge sat behind the bench would see a homeowners association simply defending its rights. The bailiff called the room to order, and a side door opened. Nathaniel walked in, not in the weather jacket Karen had always seen him wearing at the bridge, but in a black robe, taking his seat behind the bench as the presiding judge for the emergency docket that morning. Karen's face went pale. The folder in her hand slipped, papers scattering across the floor. Denise turned to her, realizing in that same instant that neither of them had ever bothered to learn who the stubborn rancher across the bridge actually was. Nathaniel didn't rule on the substance of the case himself. He stated plainly for the record that he was the property owner in question, and immediately recused himself, transferring the matter to an independent judge from a neighboring county. Before stepping down, he ordered one thing within his emergency authority: the immediate removal of the gate, effective within the hour, and the preservation of every association record tied to the bridge closure. Karen tried to object, accusing him of using his position out of personal spite. Nathaniel replied evenly that recusing himself the moment he saw his own name on the file was exactly how he intended to keep the process fair, and that the case would now be decided by someone who had never once met either of them. The next morning, Judge Miriam Okafor, brought in from a neighboring county with no ties to either side, reviewed the federal land grant, the time-stamped camera footage, and the fraudulent survey Karen had commissioned. She ruled within hours the bridge closure had been a deliberate, unlawful obstruction of a federally protected right-of-way, carried out with clear intent to pressure a landowner into surrendering his property. She fined Millbrook Ridge Homeowners Association $9 million in damages, covering the cost of Nathaniel's losses, the fraudulent survey, and punitive damages for what she called a calculated attempt to starve a man off his own land. The board was ordered to dissolve within 90 days, its remaining funds placed under independent oversight, and every fine ever issued against Nathaniel was voided in full. Karen was removed from the board by unanimous vote of the remaining residents before the sun set that same day. Nathaniel had the gate dismantled and the bridge reopened by evening, the old wooden planks bare again for the first time in weeks. He didn't celebrate the ruling, didn't gloat, didn't even mention it to his cattle as he walked them back down to the creek. A neighbor asked him later if it felt good to win. Nathaniel said he hadn't beaten anyone, he'd simply waited long enough for the truth to hold its ground, the same way that bridge had held its ground for 80 years before anyone ever thought to question who it belonged to.